Want to advertise your business in a cost-effective way? It's time to give podcast advertising a try. Research shows a high rate of podcast listeners made a purchase as a result of an ad they heard on a podcast. Visit podbean.com/brands to launch a cost-effective podcast advertising campaign in minutes. That's podbean.com/brands.
Justice is a true crime podcast, therefore deals with incidents of violence, disturbing imagery and explicit content. Listener discretion is advised. The Lady Justice podcast wishes to offer their deepest condolences to the victims' families and wishes to offer thanks to those that work in emergency services. Hello my lovelies and welcome to Lady Justice, a true crime podcast. Lady Justice is a weekly podcast that covers fascinating cases, both past and present. My name is Chantal and I'm your friendly true crime junkie with slight caffeine addiction issues. I hope everyone is feeling grand and enjoying a glorious week, and as always, before I get into this week's episode, I just want to ask you guys to please support this podcast. Subscribe, rate and leave a review, hopefully positive, and because sharing is caring, I do want you to tell everyone you know, repeatedly. It would make the world of difference, and if you would like to contact me about anything at all, please feel free to do so via social media or my email, which you'll find in the show notes. It's been a rather hectic week for me. Everyone's been kind of ill, so this is slightly late, but I am eager to get into part 3 and the final episode of the Reg Christie case. So if this is the first episode that you're tuning into, go back to the first and get all caught up. So far we've discussed his childhood, early criminal career and his known murders up to the year of 1952. The notorious British serial killer, Reg Christie, had been known to kill at least 5 women by the time he came to his deadliest year, 1953. In this episode, we take a look at the 46 days in which his final murders take place, his eventual downfall, and the consequences of this case. So, without further ado, I just want to give a shout out once again to Leon, the Christmas elf, for requesting this case, and I just want to give a little background on the landscape in which these last murders took place. This case takes place in the Notting Hill area of London at a time when it was not as affluent as it is now. During the 1940s and 50s, it was known as a bit of a slum. One previous resident had described it as a massive slum, full of multi-occupied houses, crawling with rats and rubbish. We left off just before Christmas in 1952, just as Reg Christie had murdered his wife Ethel via strangulation and laid her body to rest under the living room floorboards. Now we're going to explore what came next during the final year in this case, 1953. As always, all my sources will be listed in the show notes. So let's get on it like a car bonnet. With Ethel gone, Christie was alone in the flat. Isolated and now a single man who was about to escalate. Christie had resigned from his job on December 6th and had been unemployed since then. To support himself, 10 days later, on December 16th, Christie took his wife's engagement ring to a pawn shop and sold it for £1.17. A week after that, he sold her watch and wedding band. He kept writing letters to her sister in Sheffield up until the early January, claiming that she was still ill and it had prevented her from writing herself. On Christmas Day in 1952, the neighbours at number 9, Mr. and Mrs. Gregg, feeling sorry for the sickly middle-aged man whose wife was absent and had no children, welcomed the lonely Christie to spend Christmas with them in the most British of ways, where they drank, sang and made merry. Every week he went to the unemployment office to collect his unemployment benefit. On January 26, 1953, he forged his wife's signature and emptied her bank account. Closing the account, he walked away with £10, 15 shillings and 2 pence, which is round about £336 today. On January 8, 1953, Christie sold most of his furniture, only keeping 3 chairs, a kitchen table and a mattress to sleep on. One of these chairs was his murder chair, an old-style deck chair with rope instead of canvas fabric. This was the chair that he would use whilst gassing his victims in the kitchen, propping it in between the kitchen table and the closed door. After early February, Christie no longer bothered to respond to the letters from relations asking after his wife. His neighbours persisted asking after Ethel, and although he'd given different accounts of her location, such as in Sheffield with family or Birmingham under a new employment contract, no one questioned the respected gentleman Reg Christie. 1953 was Christie's most lethal year, beginning his spree just before emptying Ethel's bank accounts on or around January 19th. The spree would take 3 more women's lives. Rita Nelson was born in Belfast, Ireland on October 16, 1927. The middle daughter of James and Lily, a labourer and housewife respectively. Growing up working class and religious, she began to rebel at a young age. Her first court appearance was for theft at 13 years old. She appeared before judges a few more times in her teens for petty crimes before the age of 19 when she was cited for prostitution. She wasn't a bad girl by a long shot, just lost and misunderstood. It was a dangerous career, being a woman exchanging sex on the streets, once being viciously assaulted by a client, but she had her reasons. She was a young mother with a 2-year-old son called George to provide for. Eventually, however, he was taken into the care system, and the devastating blow made Rita internalise further. Trying to leave her troubles behind, she went to England with her cousin to try and make a fresh start. She attempted to gain work as a waitress, but due to her criminal background, she found it challenging having small tenures of employment at various establishments. By 1953, she was a 25-year-old woman in trouble. She was pregnant. She lived in a small rented flat and had begun to struggle with a pregnancy. She worked as a counter-server at a Lions Cafe, but her employer soon found out about her situation. They then moved her to the kitchen staff and arranged for her to see the company's medical officer. On January 12th, the doctor referred her to the Samaritan Hospital for Women for additional prenatal consultation. She never got to keep the appointment. According to Christie in later interviews, he was a bit of a lady magnet. All the wrong type of ladies just couldn't get enough of him. He recounted how he'd met the vulnerable Rita to a psychiatrist whilst in Brixton Prison awaiting trial. Rita had been visiting her elder sister who lived in Ladbroke Grove, just down the road from Christie's home. She and her sister were in a pub drinking heavily on or around January 19th when Christie spotted them. He also stated he met Rita in a cafe. No one can be quite sure which one is correct. Describing the events before Rita's death came about, he recounted, "She made suggestions that she would stay for a few days as a sort of payment in kind. I was rather annoyed and told her that that sort of thing didn't interest me. I think she was starting to say I was making accusations against her when she saw nothing was doing. She said that she would bring some boys down to do me in. I believe it was then that she mentioned something about her having Irish blood. She had a violent temper, and I remember she started fighting. I'm quite quiet and I avoid fighting. I know there was something else, it's in the back of my mind." What is more likely is that after hearing of her distress about being 6 months pregnant and worried for her future, he offered his expertise as an abortionist. He persuaded her that he could help her abort the child as a doctor who was just out of work at the time. He then coaxed her to accompany him back to Ringlington Place. It can only be assumed of what she thought of the filth in which he lived. As Rita looked around, all she would have seen is a scraggly old dog and a cat running around, a mouldy mattress on the floor and some chairs and a kitchen table for furniture. The horrific stench of the property was a mix of industrial-strength disinfectant and his wife's decomposing body. She was gassed whilst in the deck chair, then raped in a violent and frenzied attack before being strangled with a rope. His disposal method would have to change. His temporary hiding place beneath the flat held his rotting wife. He couldn't bury Rita in the garden safely. It was cold, and the ground was solid. The wash house, having been renovated a few years previously, was used frequently by the occupants in the upstairs flats, so that was not a convenient spot to hide her remains. What to do? Christie reflected whilst he drank a cup of black tea as Rita's body grew colder on the kitchen floor next to his shined shoes. He then went to bed. When he awoke in the morning, he tackled the problem with a clear mind. In the far corner of the kitchen was a small larder with just enough space to hide a body upright. Rita wore a dress, a petticoat, a bra, a cardigan sweater and 2 vests. Christie took a piece of cloth and placed it in between her legs. He then bound her ankles together with a plastic tie in a reef knot. Christie then tied a towel over her head using the same knot. Standing her upside down, he tucked her into the back corner of the tiny pantry. It was her elderly neighbour, noticing her lodger hadn't been around and the rent overdue, that reported her missing at the Hammersmith police station. She officially remained missing until her body was later discovered. In the December of 1952, Christie met Kathleen Maloney in a cafe. Kathleen had had a tragic life. Orphaned at a young age and battling alcohol addiction, she lived a chaotic lifestyle. She was a mother of 5 with little to no support, living most of her life along the south coast. All of her children were removed from her care. When she arrived in London during September 1952, she had continued her minor criminal activity and heavy drinking. Having no real place to call home, she slept at various acquaintances' house, trying to shelter from the cold, before, in her desperation, calling the public toilets in Edgware Road home. At the end of January or thereabouts, Kathleen and her friend Maureen Biggs, another working girl, was approached by Christie, who had his raincoat draped over his arm and a thin smile across his sour face. He asked the girls if they would like to come and participate in a pornographic photo shoot. They had agreed to, with a fee of £1 each, in which Christie accepted as fair. He told the women that his wife had recently died. He had clearly excluded the fact that he had, in fact, ended his wife's life. Kathleen felt sorry for the man, and they spoke some more about their respective situations. Kathleen told the toilet attendant where she was sheltering at that she had met a man who'd offered her some clothing, but when she was at the flat, the man's landlord had asked her to leave. This was Christie. He didn't give up on Kathleen, spotting her down the local boozer on a few occasions. He proposed in his kindest voice that she should come and stay with him. He would keep her safe and warm. This was something that was warmly welcomed by Kathleen. She even informed a local postman about the offer without mentioning Christie's name. In the February, the date is uncertain but believed to be towards the beginning of the month, Christie met Kathleen and Maureen again. He gave Maureen some money for some drinks, and after a short conversation, he was seen walking out of the smoke-filled room with the intoxicated Kathleen. Though in later statements Christie would again mistake the truth about what happened, declaring Kathleen had been sexually aggressive towards him, it is more likely that he used the previous offer he made to her to lure her back to the flat. Once there, he managed to gas Kathleen into submission after placing her in his kitchen's foldable killing seat. As with Rita Nelson, Christie violated the unconscious and petite Kathleen whilst he strangled her to death with a smooth rope or electrical cord. He did not hesitate over what to do with the corpse this time. Placing a white vest that she'd been wearing in between her legs, he then propped her up in the chair and retired to his mattress on the floor. The cotton cardigan and another vest that she wore were still on her person. The following morning, Christie went to his kitchen and made tea, sitting down next to the dead woman like it was the most normal thing in the world. Christie then wrapped Kathleen's body in a blanket, holding it together with a sock tied around her feet in a reef knot. He put a pillowcase over her head and fastened the opening at the neck with another sock. He dragged her body into the cupboard with Rita Nelson. Kathleen was placed on her back with her legs vertically resting against the rear wall, resting on his previous victim's head. Hectorina McLennan was Christie's final victim. Born to William and Marion on February 18, 1926, in Glasgow, she was surrounded by a loving family having 5 siblings. She was a typical Scot, resourceful, witty and tough as old boots. She'd had a pretty stable childhood and dreamed of replicating her life for her own children one day, a family with a loving husband and healthy children. She initially had this with a handsome RAF serviceman. However, with him serving, their relationship seemed strained. It was in 1948 when her entire family moved to London, and an offer was made to Hectorina by her parents to come and stay with them in their new home. She was living in Cardiff at this time and had an 8-year-old daughter. As mothers do, she put her girl first. Thinking of the more consistent life surrounded by a big loving family, she decided to take their offer up. Her partner agreed that this would be best, and they continued their relationship long distance, taking every opportunity they had to see each other. Being a proud, hard-working woman, she put money into the household kitty by working part-time in cafes and cinemas around the Hammersmith area. Hectorina, away from her husband for long periods, had an affair and fell pregnant with her second child in April 1950. After her second daughter was born, the truth came out and her marriage broke down. Her husband left for overseas and the reality of single motherhood beared down hard on the strong woman. She worked for a while as a nanny and received welfare from the National Assistance Board. The toll was showing on the 26-year-old and her parents became worried. Thinking that the smog-filled capital may not be the best place for them, her parents suggested that they should move to the Highlands in Scotland. I believe it was likely that Hectorina was suffering from postnatal depression. 7 months after the birth of her beautiful daughter, her marriage breaking down and becoming a shadow of her former self, she must have been feeling guilty for not succeeding at her planned life. Hectorina decided that she would ask her parents to take her children to Scotland and she would stay behind, try to make her own way, earn enough money and come back when she could be the best mother she could be. They agreed, and in the October, her family left. That's when she began to spiral, the overwhelming depression of not having her kids or parents nearby, and struggling to find employment. Her life became a painful knot of choices that led her into a path of a killer. On March 3, 1953, the 26-year-old was exiting a cafe with her boyfriend Alex Baker, who she'd met when she was a nanny. As Baker crossed over the road to talk with a friend, Christie struck up a conversation with Hectorina. During the chat, she told Christie that she and Baker had been evicted from their flat and were looking for somewhere to stay. Christie offered them both to stay with him on a temporary basis, but there was one condition: they were not to sleep together. Alex would have to sleep in the lounge, whilst the pretty Hectorina would stay in the kitchen. After 3 nights at number 10, Christie asked them to leave. Christie then said during his interrogations, "The girl came back alone. She asked if Alex had called and I said no, but I was expecting him. She said she would wait, but I told her she couldn't and he may be looking for her and that she must go and that she couldn't stay there alone. She was very funny about it. I got hold of her arm and tried to lead her out. I pushed her out of the kitchen. She started struggling like anything and some of her clothing got torn. She then sort of fell limp as I got hold of her. She sank to the ground and I think that some of her clothing must have got caught around her neck in the struggle. She was just out of the kitchen in the passageway. I tried to lift her up but couldn't. I then pulled her into the kitchen onto a chair. I felt her pulse. It wasn't beating. I pulled the cupboard away again and I must have put her in there." Hectorina had been choked, but not by her own clothes as Christie stated. What was used was a length of electrical cord, and she'd been strangled only after being gassed first, punched in the face and violently sexually assaulted. After interviews with her boyfriend Alex Baker, a clearer picture appeared. On the 3rd and final day they stayed with Christie, all the rations had run out, and they were due to go and sign for welfare. Christie had arranged to meet Hectorina back at the Rillington place at lunchtime, but she was scheduled to meet Baker later in the day at 3 p.m. He waited at the cafe where they had planned for 45 minutes or so, and when she didn't turn up, he went to find Christie at home. Christie told him that Hectorina never showed up, and that he would help Alex in the search to find her. After days of looking in every dark doorway in the gloomy streets of London, Christie suggested that maybe the young mother had just found it too hard to be away from her children and had returned to her native Scotland. After nights on his worn feet, Alex resigned to the idea. The smell inside the ground floor flat had become unbearable, almost eye-watering. Christie decided that it was only a matter of time before questions he couldn't answer would be asked. He needed to make a swift exit, but to leave, he needed funds. Asking around in the neighbourhood pubs and snack bars, he met a couple that required cheap accommodation. He invited the couple to view the flat and pass the smell off as something that would be fixed in the coming weeks. A sewer issue, maybe. Desperate for a place to stay, they accepted the flat from Christie, who had alleged to them that he had had a 16-year lease on the property and he had the power to sublet. Christie then took 3 months' rent in advance of them, totalling just under £8. Christie then asked to borrow a suitcase from them before packing up the last of his now baggy pinstripe suits and leaving Rillington Place on the 20th of March. The couple, however, did not have long to get adjusted to their new accommodations. The very next day, the genuine landlord came to the flat to inquire about Christie's 2-month rent arrears and was startled to find them there. He was understandably outraged. Christie had no right to sublet the flat, and he asked the couple to leave the next morning promptly. With a much larger vacant flat going to waste, the landlord told another tenant of 10 Rillington Place, Beresford Brown, that he could have use of the ground floor flat's kitchen. Beresford came down from the top floor flat, the same one that Timothy and Beryl Evans lived in with their daughter Geraldine, and noticing the stench, decided that the first order of business was to give the place a deep clean. It was around about 9 a.m. on March 24th. Beresford liked music whilst he worked, as many do, so the first thing he wanted to do was put up a shelf for his wireless radio. He began to tap on the walls to try and find a suitable place, and strangely, one part of the wall appeared hollow. About halfway down, at the edge border of the wallpaper, it was peeling away ever so slightly, so he pulled it back to check what was behind. Finding a door, he opened it slowly. What he witnessed made him stagger back in terror. He saw the back of a dead woman. She was semi-naked and decomposing. Beresford alerted the police immediately. When officers appeared at the scene, they opened the door to the small larder. What they discovered would haunt them for the rest of their lives. The 3 final victims of the sadistic madman were stacked inside the small storage space. Hectorina was found with her back to the officers, leaning forward. She was wearing only a bra, garter belt and stockings. Her wrists had been bound together by a handkerchief tied in a reef knot. Just behind her stood the bodies of Rita and Kathleen. All 3 were in the same position that Reg Christie had left them when he enclosed them weeks before. Later the same day, after noticing the floorboards in the living room were loose, the police took them up. There was some loose rubble underneath, and after a short dig, they found the remains of a 4th woman, Ethel Christie. A guard was placed on duty overnight, as the search was to continue in the morning. The next morning, when police combed the garden, they first noticed the femur that had been used to support the fence. It was the same thigh bone that had been there in 1949, when the garden was previously searched by police and apparently missed. They then examined a metal bin. The bottom dropped out, and pieces of charred and fractured bones scattered on the floor. They carefully sieved down to a depth of 2 feet in the ground. They came across skeleton remains of 2 females. Having been buried almost a decade ago, with no facial features, as a skull was missing off one and the other had been smashed into 92 pieces. Fingerprints were amiss due to the decomp. They believed a positive identification would be improbable. A stroke of luck had intervened, and on the smashed skull there remained some teeth. One tooth had a crown made of metal that was uncommon in the UK, but frequently used in Central Europe. They were able to track the dentist and identify Ruth First. The missing skull of the second victim laid to rest was found in Kensington Mortuary, a relic almost lost to time. It had been dropped through a badly boarded up bombed house at 133 St Mark's Road years earlier. A missing persons report helped to track the identity of Muriel Eady. As the police searched the rubbish pile in the garden, they spied a small metal tobacco tin, and the box inside was empty, except for 4 matted clumps of pubic hair. They then exhumed Beryl Evans' corpse, but it did not provide a match. Having checked against Ethel Christie, it didn't match there either, and although 3 of the matted clumps matched Rita Nelson, Kathleen Maloney and Hectorina McLennan, the 4th clump of pubic hair was never identified. After his departure from his home of 15 years, Christie went to a hostel in King's Cross known as Roton House. Using his real name, he paid for a 7-night stay. However, when the news of the discovery of his gruesome crimes came to light just 4 days later, he abruptly left without saying a word. On edge, worried that the police may catch up with him at any moment, he began to sleep rough, spending nights on park benches and wandering around the busy city. His face was on the cover of every newspaper in London, so he tried his best to stay in the shadows. He would hide in the back of cafes and in his old love, the cinema. His hat was lowered, veiling his face, and overcoat collar pulled up to hide his features. His body was weakened. An already sickly man, the life of a vagrant performed vicious games on his exhausted body, so he devised a plan. Finding a telephone box, he scrambled to recover some of the last loose coins in his possession and called a reporter he knew well. 3 years previously, whilst Evans was on trial, the chief crime reporter of the News of the World newspaper, Norman Ray, came to interview Christie about the horrific murder. On the frosty night of March 29th, the dim streetlights illuminated the rotary dialer in the red box as Christie whispered into the phone, "Do you remember me?" His unique voice was instantly recognised by Ray. They conversed for a few minutes, both pulses racing. Christie needed money. The newspaper had money. He would then arrange an exclusive with Ray and set a covert meeting at Wood Green Town Hall a few hours later. Ray knew that this was an opportunity he could not miss, and arriving outside the town hall in his dark car, he spotted a slim, medium-height individual, shoulders hunched and head lowered, appear from the shadows, just down to the side of the building. As he focused his eyes on the figure, he saw it swiftly retreat back into the shadows. When he looked around to see what had startled the man, he saw 2 police constables patrol just past his car. He knew that the chance had gone. Christie had run off into the night and was to sleep off his disappointment under the stars. On the last day of March, Christie was on the bank of the Thames at Putney Embankment, inclining over the railing and staring at the glassy cold waters of the river. A police constable named Thomas Ledger strolled past and thought the man looked suspect, thinking that he may have been the man the whole of London was on high alert for. Ledger paused and questioned the man his name. "John Waddington," responded the man. He said he was 35 years old and waiting to get his unemployment papers. Ledger asked the man to remove his hat. Once Ledger got a good look at him, with his bald head and his murmuring voice, he instantly recognised who stood in front of him. Ledger arrested him and escorted Christie to Putney Police Station. Understanding that the trick of a false name would provide him with little benefit, Christie gave his real name. John Reginald Halliday Christie, the monster of Rillington Place, as he had been come to know, had been caught. All he had in his possession was a newspaper clipping about Timothy Evans. Christie's trial began on June 22, 1953, in Court 1 of the Old Bailey. the same court where Evans had been tried and sentenced to death. He was on trial solely for the murder of his wife, as was the practice of the time, although evidence was presented concerning the other women found murdered at the property. Christie pleaded insanity and claimed to have a poor memory of the offence due to bouts of insomnia and blackouts that had plagued him for years. Reg Christie's defence was paid in full by the Sunday Pictorial newspaper, which is now known as the Sunday Mirror. They did so in exchange for a full account, in Christie's own words, of his crimes. They received his chilling confession in forms of letters, all pointing to how he was a hapless victim of circumstance. He was irresistible to these women, and he had acted in self-defence. A real man upholding real values, he thought. The trial was incredibly short and lasted just 4 days. He had confessed to the murders of Ruth First, Muriel Eady, Beryl Evans, Ethel Christie, Rita Nelson, Kathleen Maloney, and Hectorina McLennan. The only thing that the jury needed to decide on was, did Christie kill these women, or more importantly his wife, amid insanity, or was he just a murderer of his own free will? The jury rejected his plea and, after 86 minutes, found him guilty of murdering his wife. As the black cap was being set on Mr. Justice Finnemore's head, he was uttering the words, "There is only one sentence known to our law, and there suffer death upon hanging." Some MPs tried to postpone the execution so that Christie could talk more about his earlier murders, noting that the trophies in the tobacco tin had yet not all been matched to victims. But the then Home Secretary Maxwell Fyfe refused to grant this. Christie was however examined after the trial by John Scott Henderson QC, the Recorder of Portsmouth, whom had been appointed to conduct an inquiry into the case, published later that same year. It was also of importance to get Christie to admit the murder of little Geraldine Evans, which is something he did not do publicly. It is mentioned in the Brabin Report of 1966 that he had affirmed it privately, but this does seem to be a rumour, and if you'd like to know more, I would highly suggest you read it. Unlike Evans, Christie chose to forego any appeals. A short date for his execution was set, and he was moved from Brixton Prison to death row at Pentonville. He sat in a tiny cell just metres away from where Timothy Evans had done only 3 years previously. On July 15, 1953, John Reginald Halliday Christie, 54 years old, mounted the gallows at Pentonville Prison. His ankles and wrists were bound. The white cap was placed over his head before the knotted noose was lowered around his neck. His executioner was Albert Pierpoint, the same man who had hanged Timothy Evans. Christie whinged that his nose was itchy, but he couldn't scratch it. His executioner rebutted, "It won't bother you for long." Did Christie murder more than 8 people? It looks plausible that these were not his only victims. As a wartime policeman, there would have been many chances to kill and to get rid of a body in a destroyed building. The clumps of pubic hair that didn't belong to any known victims would suggest that there would be others. And the amount of time between the at least early murders are very long, which is exceptional. But these are questions that can never be answered. Some women did get lucky, some got away from him, so we know from witnesses that he had at least attempted to lure women to his killing chamber in the kitchen. There were 2 major inquiries held into the relation of the Christie case and the miscarriage of justice against Timothy Evans. Evans was granted a royal pardon in 1966 for the charge against killing his wife. Unfortunately, in the eyes of the law, he was still officially named as the murderer of his daughter. His half-sister had fought to try and clear his name, and in 2003 was awarded compensation for Tim's wrongful death. The government agreed that it was highly unlikely that Evans had killed his daughter, and in 2004, a government spokesman told press that it is accepted that Evans was innocent on all charges. However, it would cost too much money to make this official in writing. It can also be noted that because of the wrongful hanging of Timothy Evans, one of the most notorious wrongful convictions, that the death penalty was scrapped in the UK. The law was first placed in front of Parliament in 1964 with much public support, and a suspension on all hangings was put into place in 1965. The death penalty was officially abolished in 1969. Another law that can be credited to have roots in this case is the abortion law. With backstreet abortionists a common practice in the UK at the time, it was an incredibly dangerous situation to find yourself in as a woman. People like Christie preyed on these women for their own greed, thinking little of the medical knowledge needed. The woman's right to choose was officially made law under the Abortions Act in 1967, giving women the safety of using a licensed medical practitioner to terminate a pregnancy if they so wished. So, what do you think then? There is just so much more you could cover in this. And what do you make of Ethel, Christie's wife? Was she a bit of a ninny, foolish enough not to suspect, or do you think she knew? What do you think about other possible murders? I have read of at least 2 other possible victims that can be linked to Christie, but the sources are slightly unreliable due to just time passing. Let me know what your thoughts are. This week's recommendation is one that I've been listening to since very early on in its release. I think I started on the 2nd or the 3rd episode. It was one of the first true crime podcasts I actually listened to. Hosted by John Allure, Who Killed Teresa is an endearing and detailed listen, initially covering the case of his sister Teresa Allure, who was a 19-year-old university student in the western townships of Quebec that went missing during 1979. Her body was later discovered, and the perpetrator or perpetrators of the crime have yet to be caught. John covers many cases of young women who have gone missing or murdered in similar circumstances, and is always meticulous in his research. It's a raw and heartfelt podcast by a victim's advocate, which is respectful and detailed. A very good listen if you are a true crime fan. I have spoken to John and I'm looking into covering the case in detail next year. All of John's social media and podcast links are listed in my show notes, so please go support his podcast, show some love and recommend it to someone else. I really do hope that John and his family can get the answers to who killed Teresa and gain some closure soon. Now, after all this death, I hope you're ready to put some goodness back in the world. This week's small act of kindness is a nice simple one. Children at hospitals can have extended stays away from their beloved possessions and can often feel bored, scared and worried. Being stuck in an unfamiliar surrounding is stressful, so let's try and make it a little bit more comfortable. Pop down to your local pound shop, pick up a couple of colouring books, some crayons and drop them off at your local hospital's children ward. It may stay off some boredom and help a little one forget their troubles for a while. And that's not a bad thing, is it? So with that, go be good people, go be kind, go be safe and most importantly, go be happy. Toodle pip and cheerio.